Good morning to everyone. We're delighted to be hosting a session today. We've had 260, I think it was, responses to registered to today, so which is our largest session, definitely this year and potentially ever. So something about today is resonating with you, and we really look forward to unpacking that as Louise and I have a conversation. Today we're going to talk about the advisory board market, and I'll introduce Louise officially in a moment, but this is hot off the press, only a couple of days old. So we're so grateful to Louise for allowing our audience to be one of the very first people to start to hear and see some of the stats around this, because it has shifted a fair bit in the last couple of years. I'm Jacinta Whelan. I'm a partner here at the Melbourne practice of Watermark, and I'm joined by all the partners across the board, search and interim practices of Watermark. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders participating in this meeting and webinar. As always, we're delighted to bring you webinar discussions on topics that are pertinent to you and that go across our executive, our board and our search practices. The topic of advisory boards is really relevant for two main reasons, I thought, as we were preparing for today. More and more organisations are putting them in place. So how do we think about this from the client side and what they want? And then if we think about this from the candidate, the individual side, as you look at your ideal portfolio mix, a lot of people are suggesting that, you know, some governance boards, some advisory boards and some interim work and some other consultancy work is your ideal mix of how you'd love a portfolio to shape up. And as one of those pillars, we really want to sort of be able to provide you the latest thinking in this. Before I start, some housekeeping. You'll notice that the session is being recorded, and use the chat to share any learnings, experiences, or to take questions. Louise and I have set some time aside at the end. This always generates some really good questions. There's a fair bit that comes out across the session, so we will save those questions until the end. We will be hosting this as sort of a discussion amongst us. So Louise and I'll talk to each other and ask some questions along the way, and then we'll invite you to jump in at the end. The session will run for an hour. We will honour that time with you. Let me move to introducing Louise. The Advisory Board Centre is the leading professional body for the advisory sector, and their mission is to raise the standard of the global advisory sector through training and professional development. The founder of the Advisory Board Centre is none other than Louise, who we've got with us today. Louise is an award-winning entrepreneur, researcher and business advisor with both industry and government recognition, the local, national and international level, for her contribution to the Australian business sector. Pardon me. Louise brings a unique perspective in that she's sat on both sides of the table. She's the founder of a business, and she's also the chair of multiple advisory boards. After establishing the advisory board in 2004 for her own business, Louise recognised firsthand how a well-run advisory board can positively impact CEOs and the business at large. And upon exiting her business, she decided to start this business to be able to help others and get the value out of it that she did herself. Now, as the founder and CEO of the Advisory Board Centre, Louise facilitates leading executive education programs for incredibly ambitious, progressive and committed advisory board members, supporting their professional development and in turn the businesses they serve. Before I hand over to Louise, we're going to ask a quick interactive question to see, out of the audience we've got today, where are people sitting in this conversation? So the question to you all is, what is your current level of exposure to the advisory boards? Take a moment and I'll have a drink. Ali's pulling the levers behind the scenes, so she'll give us the answers to this in just a moment. And what we can see, I'm not sure you can all see it, but that currently we've got 31% of people who are attending today who are currently on an advisory board. We've got 31%, a third, seriously looking at this. And we've got another 38% who are sort of interested to understand a bit more about this. So Louise, hopefully that gives you a good sense of the audience, can frame up some of the questions, and I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jacinta, and thank you everyone for your genuine interest in what's happening in the advisory board sector. I'll just get straight into it. The State of the Market report was officially launched this week. So the report we produce every 2 years and really maps the advisory board sector and what's going on in the sector, not only in Australia, but globally. So it's great to be able to have this time with you today. As Jacinta mentioned, we're as the professional body, it's about raising the standard of the advisory sector. We started in Australia 6 years ago as a professional body in particular, and we now operate in over 25 countries, and we have members who are credentialed by us in the certification. We also support businesses, government and multinationals in evaluating what kind of advisory structure is right for them, and that's a free scoping service because many are interested and curious about advisory boards, but they don't actually necessarily know how to go about it. So that's a really important part of our role. But our key areas in research, education, professional development, and also advocacy as this sector continues to grow. The foundations of this report, there's many data points to it. And so it's really important for us to get a triangulation of the market rather than just looking at one source. So there's many people to thank, as well as the research team that's really supported me in bringing this report together, but also the advisory board community, because their assessments that they do on impact assessments on their advisory boards helps us to bring this data to actually understand where advisory boards are adding value and when they're not. So to get started, Korn Ferry and Financial Times last year both referred to the last State of the Market report, which was in 2021. And the term was saying advisory boards is the new hot governance trend. I'm not sure if it is, but we're going to take that if it's been said that it is. But it's certainly being noticed as a trend in governance at the moment. Jacinta, I'm really interested in your views because interim and advisory boards work really closely together. Have you seen a shift in the advisory board sector and how it's being viewed in the market?
Yeah, Louise, I think we've seen a shift across the board. I think people are very open to working differently over the last couple of years. What I'm seeing, if for a moment I can start the candidate side, I started by saying a lot of people have this as part of their ideal portfolio mix. So I think what you've got is a really strong supply of people in the market who are looking to this. And we're starting to hear the clients start to think about this. I think it's embryonic. I think it's got a lot, it's growing. It's nowhere near governance boards, but I think there's an exposure and awareness to it. I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing some of the numbers on that because mine's a bit more anecdotally, but I think you've got the people who are ready to do it. And, a big part of what today is. And then you've got this sort of movement of people saying this is how we're going to have to, particularly with things like the royal commissions and how do we put those layers of governance that perhaps aren't working under the current structures.
Yeah, no, terrific. Thank you. And we'll unpack some of that and where those different dynamics are happening in the market. So some of the things, we'll look at some of the key trends that are driving new advisory boards, where the profession is, some of the market trends in the different segments of the market, and where advisory boards are providing impact, and I guess a future focus on what's happening for the profession long term. So the wave of advisory boards, it just continues to grow. The advisory boards have always been in the heartland in the business sector, the $1.5 to $100 million in revenue in terms of the Australian market. That's always been very strong for advisory boards. Now we're getting growth in all other markets as well. So the growth in startup and scale-up markets, which have certain advisory board structures, the mid-market, then the corporatized advisory boards, including large organisations, multinationals, government. And so the advisory board sector is now wide and it's deep. And so it's actually changing the face of advisory boards, just I think because of the flexibility and the agility, the ability to be able to move fast when other mechanisms are slower. So it's very dynamic in the way that it's actually being used in the market in ways that we've never seen before. So I'll just cover off on some of those things. There are two key mega trends that are driving advisory boards differently in the market. The first one is that traditionally, we've always said that it's either advisory boards or governance boards, and that's a really old argument now. And I was one of them that was used to be talking about advisory boards or governance boards, and it's not. It's now and advisory boards and governance boards, and where that changes the language in the way that we think about governance, it moves out of being a governance board and now into being a governance system. And advisory boards are being used in these systems in really interesting ways. And so the governance dilemma where advisory boards are starting to play a new role is that governance boards are increasingly constrained. Directors are increasingly constrained, whether it's time, regulations, personal exposure, and the need to be knowledgeable across everything, right? So really, really stretched. But their agendas are also getting bigger. And so we had our Megatrend Summit just a few weeks ago, and there was one person there that was saying, our governance board, for me to prepare as a director, I've got 800 pages to go through to prepare for a governance board meeting. And so feeling constrained, agendas are getting bigger. You think about that, about how sustainable is that for good decision making. And so what do? The governance boards either work harder, they bring more directors on board, they bring more specialists around them, increase the executives around them, build more committees, or advisory boards, bring in specialist advisory boards, all these other things, or just wing it. And I don't think winging it is a good idea. But this is really an increased constraint. Jacinta, what do you see about, this real shift in the responsibility for directors?
Without a doubt, Louise, and the people who we interact with, I think there's a lot of people who like the idea of boards, the reality of when you get on them, and that the time commitment, the agenda, the sheer magnitude of it, and the responsibility is very significant. So I think and also good governance would suggest you could probably have 3, maximum 4 governance type boards because of that workload. So if people are looking to build a portfolio career, how do you add an advisory board into your mix that will have a different time constraint and different sort of levels of what you need to deliver? So I absolutely agree with that.
So it's interesting where directors, and we're not specialists in governance boards. You think about directors, you don't go to jail because you made a good or bad decision. You go to jail because you haven't shown good due process in the way that decision is made. And so advisory boards have this new role to play in a system of governance of these specialised advisory boards around the governance board to have time and a bit of a sandpit to be able to do the quality thinking, pulling it apart, road testing ideas, bringing it back together so that the directors are in the position of being able to make more confident, more deliberate and different decisions of which the market is potentially demanding them to do. And I think this new role for advisory boards is something that we as a profession need to take really seriously in the role that we have and the responsibility that we have to support governance board directors in the very important role that they play. And it's different. And when we think about the weight of that conversation, there's also really optimism in that as well, because advisory boards are optimistic. They're a blue sky. They're about the future. And what this enables is that growth and innovation can come back onto the agenda, where very often it gets missed with all the complexity of everything else that decisions need to be made on. So I think that's a really positive move of where advisory boards have always been optimistic in nature. The other mega trend is the stakeholder economy. And so there is a demand for in the market for decisions to be made that are potentially different to what have been made in the past. We're talking about sustainability, ESG, social constructs, economic, technology, AI, innovation, the environment, legal, diversity, like it's endless, right? And so
Louise, yeah, I'd agree with that, Louise. We're also in our latest survey, we're seeing the old toolkit that people used, whether it be boards, it be executives, the old toolkit no longer serves. And people are used to going to their little bag of tricks, for when you've got to solve a business problem, and new ideas and that innovation is what's needed. The old things aren't working anymore. So you absolutely concur that sort of, the market context and the different thinking and the innovation around your thinking absolutely is right for change.
Yeah, yeah. And in each of these, we see advisory boards across the world being used in every one of these situations. And it's really exciting to see that, because it changes the way that we're thinking inside larger organisations, let alone our heartland of the business sector. It's opening up the market into problem solving and thinking through things as a thinking system in all different environments. And it's not a fad. It's a sector that's certainly here to stay. So when we think about advisory boards for the future, it's no longer a conversation about, in a debate, what is an advisory board? Should I have an advisory board? It's more about how am I going to optimize the advisory structure that I have around me? And so in that way, and in that context, advisory boards, it's everybody's business to actually know and be across the power of them and how to use them well.
Louise, if I can just interrupt, there was a question come through, are people going to have access? We're going to send through a copy of the State of the Market report to everyone in a follow-up email.
Yes, I expect everyone to print it out, put it under the pillow, know it back to front. Thanks, Jacinta. Professional snapshot, what's happening in the profession itself. In 2021, when we've been mapping this market now since 2019, in 2021, there were 2.2 million advisory board professionals in the market. Now there's over 2.6 million. So it's grown over 20% in the last 2 years. Australia and New Zealand stay strong. It went from 3% to 4%, which I think it's about right from a world representation of the size of our market for advisory boards. Where it has grown, where I think it's really interesting, continues to be strong in the US and the UK European markets. The two markets where I see have changed, and I think they're markets to watch, is in Asia. In 2021, it was 3% of the market. Now it's over 7%. So it's more than doubled in that market, which is really interesting because they don't advertise advisory board roles there. So there's potentially some issues around that with regards to independence and conflicts of interest, where I think in that market it's very interesting conversations we're having in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, particularly at the moment. The other market I just want to make a note of is the Middle East. It didn't feature in the report at all in 2021, but it does now at 2%, the Middle East and Northern Africa. So there's a lot of innovation going on there, a lot of investment, but also cultural advisory boards really work well, where there's a lot of global interaction, but decisions are being held inside organisations themselves. So advisory boards are really interesting from a cultural perspective there too. So the growth of the advisory board sector is worldwide. And great to see. Now, Jacinta, the use of interim executive has also grown as well, hasn't it, during that time?
Yeah, Louise, you and I often sort of say it feels like both of our marketplaces are growing off an embryonic base. So they feel like they're on parallel tracks to some degree, where interim continues to grow. There seems to be the last couple of years have probably given both of our offerings sort of a real exposure and a real uplift in the marketplace. And we'll send some stats around the growth of interim in our survey, but yeah, I feel like they're on a parallel track.
Yeah, yeah. And it's that flexibility and the agility that goes with both of those ways to engage with the not only the doing, but also the thinking, where that's where the advisory board space is. We look at the advisor landscape. For those of you who are new to our research, I'll just explain this model and where advisory boards sit. And advisory boards are engaged in the market is just as one method of engagement. So it goes from informal to formal, family and friends being the most informal, peers in business where they collaborate in their thinking and shared knowledge. Business network groups is very important for the socialisation of owners, founders and executives. Then you get the one-to-one individual engagement of the accountant, business coach, mentor, consultant, potentially the interim executive here, and the individual expert advisor. Where it gets problematic is when an organisation expects one person to have the answer to everything. And individuals may go to the edges of their ethics in the way when they should and shouldn't provide advice because they want to help, not that they want to do the wrong thing. And so should the organisation be asking somebody for their expertise when it's actually moving to the edges of their own personal knowledge? This is where advisory boards now enter into that space where there's an independent chair, there's external advisors that are chosen that are fit for purpose, internal representatives, there's a charter, and there's measurement of impact, at least on an annual basis, for an all of business advisory board. So it's a mix of both internal and external representatives mainly. Then you get the governance board, which is the most serious undertaking where you can go to jail for the decisions that are made or not made. But it's also serious in a way that it's binding. It's binding on the directors, but it's binding on the organisation to implement based on those decisions that are made. Now, the market generally doesn't know the difference between an advisory board and a governance board. So most simply, the governance board is a decision-making model and it's binding. A advisory board is not a decision-making model, it's a problem-solving model, which is where it's about evaluating options, road testing ideas, but this decision stays with the organisation, either the board of directors or the executive. Now, what we're seeing now is the way that we view the advisory board sector is it's like this whole different parallel universe. So we have traditionally just talked about advisory boards as a singular format, but there are many different formats for advisory boards. It's when we call fit for purpose advisory boards. And it goes from, very agile environments where it's an on-demand advisor panel through to peer advisory boards where you get one chair and multiple businesses around it. Then the entry point of where businesses say in the long term, we want an advisory board, but we want to grow into it. And this is where an advisory board of one is a starting point. And generally they'll have an advisory board of one on the normal meeting cadence of monthly meetings for up to a year. And then they start formalising it by bringing advisors in as what we call a pop-up advisory board through to project advisory boards and then best practice advisory boards. So there's many different variations, and it's a really understanding where organisations are, where the advisory board is going to potentially add value and where it's not going to add value, and make it really clear around what the parameters about what they're there for and what they're not there for.
Louise, can I ask, who normally engages the advisory board? Is it the executive that wants some additional thinking and support around this? Is it the board themselves that engage it? Is there sort of, because today, like it's a good idea, it sounds like a good idea, right, to get that extra thinking. Where's the pushback come from?
So the scoping of an advisory board is mission critical. There are two key factors that make a really effective advisory board in my mind. One is you've got a quality charter that's been really carefully designed because it's been mapped very carefully inside the organisation. Who it reports to, who it's there to support with, where it sits within the organisation. The larger the organisation, the more important it is to map that out really carefully. And it could be to the board of directors, where it's informing the strategy. It's not forming the strategy, it's informing the strategy, or it could be informing an executive or a specialist team inside the organisation. So it's very common, as an example, for a multinational or an organisation that has business operations in other jurisdictions and other markets to have an advisory board to support a localised CEO in market. And so we just scoped out this week an advisory board for an Indian-based company that's setting up their operations in Spain. So they're setting up their advisory board first, then they're recruiting the CEO. So that way they've got that localised support in that market. And so the answer might cop out to many things, just it depends.
It depends, yeah.
It depends, yeah.
And there, I would imagine there's a tendency, time is of the essence here. So, the good governance that sits around your charter for an advisory board, I would imagine people just want an advisor, that one-on-one informal, can you help me understand my,
Yeah.
digital strategy or my cyber strategy?
Yeah.
So the piece here is to almost slow it down, I'm hearing, put the structure in of what that person's going to deliver so that you sort of slow down to go fast.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not relying on one voice.
Yes.
It's the quality of the conversation. And actually, that's a really good segue, Jacinta, into the confidence test. Ultimately, advisory boards is a construct, right? But and the way it's constructed, it reveals itself in the mapping process. But we shouldn't lose sight of why would you have an advisory board? Why would you have an interim executive or a consultant? And we've got to be thinking about what's the impact that's actually required. And in our research, we found that for someone to feel confident in the decision that they're making, there are three things that really must happen. First of all, they've got to have confidence in the advice that they're receiving. Secondly, they've got to be confident in the information that they've got. And so many people talk about AI, right? And the access to information and how easy it is. But that's only one dimension. And is that information the right information to be thinking about? And then lastly, and I think this is the most important part, is their own confidence in their ability to be able to execute on the advice that's being received and the decision that they make. So it's really complex what happens in that interaction in that one moment between an advisor and an advisee. And that's what we call the value exchange. We're going to continue. We've only just started researching this one key point that I think is just going to explode into this whole new world around confidence in decision making. So there's a lot that's going on. We do hear from the market, including advisory board professionals that may complain from time to time, saying, I gave them that advice. They didn't listen. They should have, right? That whole should have. But we need to really remind ourselves there is a lot more going on than just our advice in the complexity and how they have to make a decision. The other part of that is the research that we've really identified, the power of three. We know that advisory boards are adding a different value when there's three independent sources of advice. Better decisions are made and greater benefits are actually achieved. And so that's where advisory boards is not just making a satisfactory decision, but making an optimal one. So what's going to be the best decision that we can make? And when you've got three independent sources informing that decision, we know that you're able to optimize decisions in a much more robust way. If I look just briefly at market trends, the market trends around the business sector, corporatized advisory boards and project advisory boards. The business sector includes two components, the emerging market and the mid-market. 29% of advisory boards are in the emerging market, and there's a high level of volatility. So advisory structures really need to be very flexible, which is why advisor panels work really well, because they start something, they stop, they're still trying to figure out who they are. So fixed structures are problematic for businesses less than 1.5 million in revenue turnover. The business market, though, the average size of the business sector, the 1.5 to 100 million, the most common starting point is between $1 to $1.5 million in revenue turnover. So they're quite small, and it's great that they're actually getting into the getting external advice. The most common structure is two internal representatives, an independent chair, and two external advisors. And their investment generally is between $40,000 to $70,000 a year, based on the cadence of a chair meeting on a monthly basis and having 4 advisory board meetings when you bring the external advisors in per year.
Do the external advisors work completely independent of the governance board? Do they attend the meetings? Do you have one of the internal directors run a subcommittee, which sort of almost like the advisor group? They're on that as well.
It could do. The main thing with external advisors is really and these three, the power of three is like the independent chair, 2 external advisors. That's the 3. The challenge is always the independence test. Right? Are they independent? And independence is a really interesting thing. They're not always independent, but then you've got to really think about the consequences of not having independent advice, because that creates second agendas, and potential conflicts of interest. So just got to think about the consequences of the way that it's structured. There's many ways advisory boards are structured. This is just the most common structure of an advisory board in the business market. Yeah. The governance dilemma we talked about, and that governance dilemma is now impacting on the usage of advisory boards in corporatized environments. The big ones at the moment is sustainability advisory boards, specifically around the sustainability ESG agenda, cyber, supply chain, mergers and acquisitions, innovation. But customer advisory boards is a big, very smart, savvy structure, both for wanting to have advisory boards like Amazon and Salesforce do it really well, where they have the internal role called the advisory board manager, which is a new role that we're seeing in the market. We didn't see those roles 2 years ago, that are really supporting specific strategies around the advisory board structure. And then once the advisory board has met, for example, what do they do with that information internally to maximise the value of that transference of information? So advisory board managers is a really interesting new role that's emerging. Yeah, just an area for you.
Yeah, in terms of that, we haven't seen or been asked for that yet. Doesn't mean that it's not emerging, but what I would imagine that role at the moment is sitting as someone internally will pick that up as, as another part of their role until it becomes their own independent role and big enough to be. Yeah. But, what fascinates me is we often talk about the roles that we'll be doing in the future don't even exist yet. And here is one of those roles, this didn't even exist and here it is. So the emergence of new roles is always fascinates me.
Yeah, and look, the great case study on this is the aged care sector. So for those of you that are involved with the aged care sector, there is so much work to be done in this space. Advisory boards have been regulated for the very first time in aged care, where all aged care providers, both home care as well as for providers, have to have 2 advisory board structures by the 1st of December. Now, what we're seeing is some of those executives, internal executives, that function takes up between 25 to 30% of their executive role in managing these functions. So that's going to be a really interesting area to watch.
Yeah. So thank you. There's so many questions, but we're going to keep some of them to the
I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to really fast. The area that I'm most excited about is the rise of project advisory boards. We talked about these specific fit-for-purpose advisory boards. In 2021, 34% of advisory boards were project-based. Now it's 53%. So I think this will continue to be utilised and will take over where all of business advisory boards have been the main model for advisory boards. This is the future of advisory boards. So it's very exciting to see that actually being used so rapidly in the market.
That very much aligns with sort of the accessing an interim executive. You're coming in short, sharp, solve a problem, deliver big impact. You had there 3 to 18 months. Ours is probably normally sort of 8 to 10 months. Of sort of come in, impact, being able to borrow in, if you use the sort of language of buy, build, borrow by David Ulrich, borrow in the skills you need at the point in time you need them, rather than have them set up as long ongoing structures that no longer serve the moment in time. So again, I can just see those parallel tracks running.
Yeah, 8 to 10 months. What was the third? You've got buy, borrow, and
build. That's in terms of HR talk. That would be what you do with your talent. You can either buy it in, which is what we would call our search business. You can borrow it, which is our interim business, or you can build it, which is when you do retraining internally, etc. Buy, build is sort of how people think of talent.
Yeah, that's great. I love that language. That's great. Not all advisory boards are successful. 90% of them are when we are measuring it. This is particularly a study that we did in the business market, in the business sector, where the advisory boards were impactful. It had a 15% impact on financial results. So that's a pretty significant on average of those businesses that were studied. But what was interesting is the qualitative, wasn't just the quantitative, but the 30% increase in confidence, business confidence. So that's confidence in decision making. So imagine, Jacinta, if you were feeling 30% more confident, what what you are today and the decisions you're making, how would that make you feel?
And then you measure it, you know, it's, I love this because it's quite raw, right? You know, 10% of the time it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. So yeah, and looking at that 10%, what's interesting about that 10% is that the most common characteristic of those businesses, what they were going through at the time when they had their advisory board, was a cash flow crisis. So advisory boards are not the answer to everything. So it needs to be very carefully mapped out to say, is the advisory board actually the right construct for this particular situation that we're in, or do we need something else? Like, do we need a specialist in? Do we need, you know, a lawyer, or an accountant, or something else that to fix specific things? Advisory boards are a thinking system, not necessarily a fixing system.
I love that.
So,
A thinking system, not a fixing system.
Yeah, I'm going to write that one down too. Yeah, I think we need to be very honest when as advisory board professionals around that scoping process to make sure it is right for the environment that it's in. Future trends, if we look at the advisory board profession, it's also changing. So people think about advisory board professionals as advisory firms, adding that as a service stream. Then portfolio professionals, which I'm gathering most people here today are really that portfolio, adding it in, where they'll have 5 to 6 gigs on at any given time generally, which advisory boards end up being about 30 to 50% of what they do. And then interim consulting is generally the other half. So that's a really interesting sort of mix. What do you see from your side there, Jacinta, about mix of portfolio?
Yeah, what comes to mind first is I can see why you need a manager to manage all these things. If you've got 5 different, you know, advisory committees happening, and you know, you've got some interims in fixing some problems for you, how does this go back into your core business without it becoming too much and trying to fix too many problems at once? Yeah, so in answer to that, you know, it's those parallel tracks again, those portfolio professionals, exactly what our pool of people are doing. I think a lot of them have the capacity to, from their years and their tenure, to advise, not execute, and that's probably the key difference. For an interim, you're sitting in the seat doing it, and running the daily function, but you absolutely, because of your years of experience and your wisdom, could sit over here and advise rather than do. So it's the, you know, so I think you're probably talking the same pool of people. It's just the work they're doing at that point in time that's best utilising their skills.
Yeah, they're applying their skills differently. One is context, this is the thinking piece, and the other piece is content, and this is the doing bit. And it's important to know the difference between the two, because sometimes when we scope out advisory boards, businesses in particular may want a blend of both, and you've got to be careful about separating out the two for sure. We are getting now beneath the surface, though, these new internal executives being advisory board professionals inside organisations, as large organisations are implementing advisory boards as part of the part of their management disciplines. This is where the market is heading to. So best practice as this sector continues to grow will continue to be more and more important as part of this self-regulation. So the best practice framework for any of those that are really interested in it, there's a free resource on the website around the ABF 101 best practice framework. That's overseen by an independent best practice and ethics advisory board that continue to monitor what's going on in the market and what pressure will that put on best practice principles for the longer term.
Louise, can we go back one slide for one moment to the iceberg? When you say internal advisory, so the manager manages it, are you seeing the pathway to be an advisor, to start running and leading an advisory project when you're an executive?
Yeah. So we see many executives starting their advisory board profession 3 to 5 years as part of their planning for their exit.
Okay.
Yeah, so they start early, they implement advisory boards inside their role. So you think about, I did a study between 2008 and 2016 on 26,000 employees in 607 businesses. I will never do a study like that again. It just drove me crazy. The number one complaint of employees across all those organisations was meetings, right? And here we are with a model to introduce more meetings. So what happens with internal executives when they're thinking about and planning for their future, it's also business owners too, before they exit, they build advisory boards in their business to help them manage their exit, but give them a pathway to something else. So instead of creating another committee or have another meeting, they actually build these really fit for purpose advisory boards inside these large organizations that are really super targeted, and really they're creating this whole new lease of life around these project meetings internally, and then learning their craft as a profession, but then potentially still managing that advisory board structure when they leave, or building up their bench strength and their knowledge, because they're actually engaging external parties, bringing the outside in. So it's just a really great way to be able to think through, instead of just saying, I'm finishing my job today and then something, my new life is completely different, a dead stop. It can actually really manage a really good transition while still being able to do the right thing by the organisation and add value to your executive role rather than trying to take value away.
Yeah, well, we've got a survey coming. Our data is there's a highlight this year on longevity and people sort of thinking about how they work for longer. So these ideas of what do you do when you're still in a role? Most of the people on this call may or may not be in a role. They may be through. Doesn't mean you've missed the boat in any way, because this is just starting to form. But what it's starting to show is the different ways of engaging your knowledge with work. And then allowing a longevity overlay to say we're all going to be working longer, we all want to contribute longer, all of that knowledge we've earned over, hard-earned knowledge. How do we best utilise that, but maybe on slightly different ways? So this is showing some lovely different ways of being able to access your knowledge and then put it back out into the market, engage it back into the market.
So Jacinta, if you just think about interim, say someone's on an interim role because there's a merger or an acquisition, or there's been some kind of transaction. They're there for that transaction period, like you said. What was that, 8 to 10 months? Once that role is finished, how do they then go and protect everything that they've just built? And so at the end of an interim exercise, building out advisory board structure, so that way you're not getting caught up in the content, you're staying at context, you're working strategically with it. So it's about not only you've created value during that interim role, but how do you then protect that whole investment that they made in you through ongoing.
Make it stick to some degree, doesn't it? You can do something and then it just fades, but how do you make it sticky?
Yeah, but you're not meddling. So you get too close to it, because now you've got to go hands off. It's over to you, but then how do you then still be that support mechanism? It's really good and sort of approach. So I'll just close off with this. Where is this sector going? We talked about now that advisory boards are being seen as the hot new governance trend. By 2025, when we'll be doing this next report, I don't gamble, but I think this is where the market's going, where advisory boards will be the new leadership trend, where advisory boards will become part of management disciplines inside organisations, where they have to demonstrate independence, and independence will become the norm in the quality of thinking, in the way decisions are being made. So some of the things that we do to support professionals, the chair certification is a program that's done 2 days in person or 4 days virtually. As this sector goes, these credentials will matter. There are unique identification codes with there, like a director's code, where over time, as this advisory board sector becomes stronger, these individual credentials and maintaining integrity for the sector will really matter in that space. The information when you receive the report, I'm really interested in the 31% of attendees today, of those that have advisory boards currently in the work that you do. I want to hear what your stories are, because this is our living research. We learn from listening to the market and what's going on, what works and what doesn't work. So I'm really interested in what people's stories are. You can download the best practice framework. The Advisor Concierge is our free service to support organisations with their thinking around their advisory structures. And then lastly, the chair program I mentioned, Penny Ellinger is also our key contact to really speak with as well, if you're interested in talking about it on either sides of the table.
All of that information will be shared with everyone. So if you've missed some of those QR codes, thank you. A lot of information there. I think you've probably got a sense of the data that sits behind that research. I've got a couple of questions, and then I'm going to go to the floor because there were lots and lots of questions. You mentioned that, you know, towards the end of the year, and that the new framework is going to be, this is going to be part of management and part of leadership, is that independence and having advisory boards. Do you think the government will mandate this? Has it already? Is it, where's it at in terms of a formal government mandate on this?
Well, it's been mandated now in the aged care sector.
Yep.
So I think where advisory boards will go in line with government regulations will be wherever there's a vulnerable customer, regulations will follow. So we already know that, say, for instance, I ran a round table yesterday in, say, the health industry, hospitals, they've got it within their own specific regulations. So I think aged care is the starting point. Disability services will be on its way. Childcare, education, the energy sector, the banking sector. Already the banking sector in the UK, I met up with a senior partner of one of the big four in London yesterday, and they were talking about, I'm just looking for my notes, they're talking about the regulations there to ensure, you know, good governance around feedback from the customer. So we're not alone in this. This is a wide thing.
One of the questions was sort of, you know, to talk about where this is most useful or impacted. Is it private companies? Is it not-for-profits? Is it and I think you've just sort of answered that, where that vulnerable customer, you know, that's where this will sort of start, or heavily regulated. So they seem to be the sort of two starting points. And then once you get sort of that momentum, others will see the benefit. Let me ask everyone on the let me ask the question that if you haven't already put in the quiz, I'm sure in the question, you probably want to know. If you work this way, what do you get paid?
So we track what's going on in the market every year with what we call our rates report for our members. The rates are really maturing in the market. So increasingly we're seeing advisory board professionals being paid. And those that do pro bono as a profession, we also need to be really careful about that mix of people doing it for free versus, you know, being paid as a profession. Generally, the rates are between $2,000 to $3,500 for half a day. Increasingly, we're seeing advisory board professionals, and especially in that role of the chair, on a set retainer for up to 3 years. So generally, it's for half days. The units of time are generally half days. Pro bono, generally, when we're looking at a portfolio of an advisory board professional, when they're doing a mix of things, 25% of their portfolio is pro bono, 75% is paid.
It's paid.
A lot of givers in this group.
Yeah, and, you know, it's probably a general theme once people are at that board stage. The reason you go on a board essentially should be to serve, because working on boards, advisory or governance, isn't a direct compensation for a large executive salary that you might have been on. So it's, you know, that probably lines up with the stage of life that people are at. They're working this way, and both of our pools, Louise, if those two tracks of people who are now looking for interesting ways to give back, some of that will be paid, some won't. In terms of your sort of 25% pro bono, we would see that in our mix as well, where people have, the image I use as a sort of a funnel with, what do they put at the top of their funnel to keep them busy, some of which is paid and some of which isn't paid. So that would very much line up with our that 25% as well. Yeah,
that's great.
In terms of sort of, let me go back a couple of questions here around the sort of the interaction between governance boards and advisory boards, and the sort of the broader acceptance in the market of these. How do you sense that's going in Australia?
It's evolving, and it's still early days. And these are early signs of the market, and it'll only get bigger, for sure. When we look at the intent of professionals wanting to do advisory boards versus governance boards future, it's being driven both by the push from from individuals saying, you've asked me to be a governance board, have you actually considered an advisory board instead? So individuals are actually negotiating and asking for that, rather than being on the governance board, and being very careful about the way that they choose which governance boards they sit on. So it's not either or, it's and, but working out the balance of that portfolio. The demand for new thinking, this critical thinking, independence in the thinking, and we don't need to talk names, but the professional services sector is really under fire with regards to conflicts of interest and independence. The demonstrating independence piece is important. Multiple voices around the table will drive better outcomes. So I think organisations will also be looking at that specialist, faster thinking system to be able to fast track some of these bigger decisions that need to be made. And the stakeholder economy is asking them to make different decisions. How do they do that?
Can you unpack a little bit more? You sort of said that 2025 leadership trend. Can you sort of explain that? That's a big concept, right? This is now going to be part of the executive toolkit. How do they access that? How do they think about it? I'm really interested in your thoughts around that.
Well, there's a case study in the report, actually, of Procter & Gamble with their Sustainability Advisory Board. And for them, they have their advisory board that meet twice a year for a full day, twice a year.
Just on sustainability? Just on sustainability.
Yeah. So they have all of their executive meeting with external advisory board members who are all senior CEO level people that are, a go-to people in the market, and they road test their sustainability strategy with these external executives. And in the words of the head of sustainability for Procter & Gamble, she said it's about bringing the outside in. And so if we're continually making decisions inside a bubble, I think the market is now looking for socially responsible decisions and well-informed decisions when the market continues to change. You cannot ignore the market when you're making decisions internally. So this is where the key is. Customer advisory boards bringing the customer, bringing the market, bringing the supply chain in, so that we are all part of an ecosystem. And it will just make better, more robust, more socially conscious decisions. Just makes really good business sense.
Makes you wonder why it hasn't happened before, but let's not worry about that, right? Bring the outside and test your thinking, but it's happening, so that's the good thing. Let me ask this. This is clearly moving fast. We had a session 2 years ago on your data, and for those on the audience, I asked Louise why she doesn't do this every year, and the research is just massive. You couldn't put this out every year. It takes 2 years to hear those stories, to do the research. But what do you suggest that for the people who are here and are interested, what do they do next? I mean, they can come and look at your course and stuff, but where does this go? What would you leave people with?
The growth of the advisory board sector is a wonderful opportunity for all of us, but it's problematic. It's problematic for the profession, of which I think our role is to caretake and protect the profession. We're having people sitting on advisory boards and establishing advisory boards who don't know what they're doing. And so we have an incredible opportunity to do this well and be impactful, use our knowledge with purpose, but with integrity. And actually, if we understand the ethical frameworks that sit around it, and that way it's not only impactful, which we all want, it's also safe. And we need that to be safe. It needs to be safe for the governance board. It needs to be safe for the executive. It needs to be safe for the individual in doing it. If you're going to do it, just do it well. And it's different. It's different to being an executive role. It's different to being a governance board director. And so winging it is just not good enough anymore, I think, as an advisory board profession. We are the only professional body in the world, and I don't mean to sound arrogant in that. It's just that it's really important that we do this really well. Australia is leading the way in the market worldwide. So why not be involved in a global community that are really dedicated to the practice. We're 6 years young as an organisation, as a professional body. We have a 100-year strategy. We've got 94 years to go to continue to nurture and build the foundations now for the future in the way business is done and the way that we think about business and the interaction with the market and with each other. That's our great opportunity, is to really lay those strong foundations today. So that's where I'd say, yes, we have the credentials. Yes, we have the membership. They are just mechanisms for us to really build a sector that we're all really proud of. And for those that are really genuinely interested in it, just don't half do it. I'd really encourage you to take yourself seriously, take this sector seriously, and be involved and be part of building something that is really a one-off opportunity that we have.
Well, thank you. Right there was Australia's leading the way. Lovely to see. How's the rest of the world picking this up? We saw the numbers in terms of growth. You're busy, sort of, I know, doing some travel to the States, to the UK. What's the feel in those conversations you have for the rest of the world's view on this?
It's exciting. Australia is our starting point worldwide. You know, we've got, I'm flying out tomorrow to one program in London, which is selling out in New York and Los Angeles the following weeks. And so the conversation is everywhere, Jacinta. It's a wave that we are really just at the beginning. Yeah.
Fabulous. I am going to, we're nearly at the top of the hour, and I really want to make sure we honour people's time. There was a lot that we didn't get to. What we will do is follow up everyone with the actual report. Louise is kind enough to be able to allow us to share that with you all. This feels like the start of a conversation, and Louise and I are really committed to keeping the conversation going. It feels like our audiences are very similar and aligned, so there's a lot of reason for us to keep that, you know, to, as Louise sort of said, put good structures around the different ways that people are working and advocate, as you know, Louise is in the background in terms of government and policy, what that needs to do, just like we're looking to do for that interim market as well. Louise, whenever I have a chat with you, I feel like my brain is being stretched, which is a lovely thing. I just love the passion that you come at this with. And the commitment, and you know, 100-year strategy, not many people can say they've got that. So thank you for your time, as always. Thank you for your partnership, and thank you everyone for attending today, and really hope that was useful. Have a good day.
Thanks, Jacinta.